Greetings, class. I am your professor. Got a little bit of a haircut, as you can tell, but it is me. I am happy to be posting this video today. I guess you saw my announcement on Blackboard. I apologize that it's taken me so long to get this posted for you, but I'm glad to be able to do it today. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Obadiah, which is our fourth book in the Minor Prophets. Obadiah's name comes from two Hebrew words, the word avad, meaning servant or to serve, and Yahweh, obviously the divine name. And so we translate Obadiah as servant of the Lord. And the book of Obadiah is actually our shortest book in the Old Testament, and actually by verse count it is the shortest book that we have in the entire Bible, which presents us with some significant issues when we talk about dating the book of Obadiah, and today we're going to talk just about three things in particular dealing with the book of Obadiah. This obviously is not going to be a long lecture because the book itself is not very long, and so I don't think we should take 45 minutes talking about a book that takes 2 minutes to read. But I do want to talk about some things that I think are important. First of all, we'll discuss dating, issues of dating Obadiah, and then we'll talk about who exactly Edom was, and then we'll kind of look at some of the issues with the day of the Lord imagery in Obadiah, because I hope by this point you're picking up on the fact that this day of the Lord imagery is pretty significant in the Minor Prophets. So when it comes to discussing the dating of the book of Obadiah, we have some real issues, and it actually is one of the hardest books that we have to date for a number of reasons. First of all, because it is so short, it really doesn't give us a lot of internal information to go on. We don't have any kind of mention of kings or anything. The book just starts out the visions of Obadiah, and then thus says the Lord God. So we don't have any real introductory information as far as listings of kings to give us any kind of dating. Secondly, the canonical order of the book, with Obadiah being placed with Hosea, Joel, and Amos, might point us in the direction of an early date for the book of Obadiah, if we accept that canonical ordering is based in part on chronology. However, if you remember, we talked about with the book of Joel how sometimes what we could have instead of chronological ordering is this canonical ordering being based on thematic connections. And so if that's the case, we clearly have a thematic link between Amos and Obadiah, which we'll get into later on. And so if that is the case, then we can't really say for sure that Obadiah is an early book, because canonical ordering may or may not speak to chronology. So we have a couple of real possibilities for the date of Obadiah, and obviously there's some leeway in between, but we're just going to kind of look at the two extremes, or potential extremes. The first is that it was written sometime around 850 BC during the reign of Jehoram. And actually, if you looked at the class notes, it indicates a more approximate date, somewhere between 848 and 841. This would, in fact, make Obadiah the earliest of the writing prophets. Even if we accept an early date for the book of Joel, we're still talking about 8th century. And so here we have Obadiah, potentially middle of the 9th century BC, which would make him extremely early in comparison to our other writing prophets. And we get this date really kind of based on conjecture more than anything else, but it's an educated guess. It's not just somebody throwing a date out there. but it's based on reading the attack mentioned on Jerusalem in Obadiah 11 through 14, in conjunction with the attack of the Philistines and the Arabians on Judah, which is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 21, 16 through 17. The Philistines and the Arabians attacked Judah during the reign of Jehoram. And then we relate that also with the rebellion of the Edomites during Jehoram's reign, which is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 21, verses 8 through 10, and also in 2 Kings 8, 20 through 22. And so we take the Philistines and the Arabians' attack on Judah, we kind of tie it in with the Edomites' rebellion, and then all of that is brought together in Obadiah 11 through 14 as these attacks on Jerusalem. And that's kind of how scholars come up with this date of about 850 BC. However, there's no real evidence to support the fact that Second Chronicles, that the chronicler envisioned an attack on Jerusalem specifically, because he doesn't mention Jerusalem, he just mentions Judah. Nor do we have any mention of the Edomites in connection with this attack on Judah in 2 Chronicles 21, 16 through 17. We have mention of the rebellion of the Edomites earlier in that chapter, but what we seem to have are two distinct events. We have the rebellion by the Edomites, and then we have the attack on Judah by the Philistines and the Arabians. So there doesn't really seem to be any connection in 2 Chronicles between these two things, indicating that the Edomites had any part in the attack on Judah. The other possibility for dating, kind of the other extreme, I guess, would be that it's sometime around the fall of Jerusalem, circa 586 BC. And we actually do have some scholars, some of the more liberal scholars, that go way beyond and want to date Obadiah to late 4th century. I mean, 310, 312 BC. We won't get that extreme. We'll say around 586 being the other end of the spectrum. And really, depending on one's stance on predictive prophecy, it could be, this date could be either prior to the fall or immediately after, which is where we get the 585 date that's noted in the class notes. Some of the more liberal scholars who don't believe in predictive prophecy see verses 11 through 14 as Obadiah recounting past events of the fall of Jerusalem. On the other hand, those of us who accept the idea of predictive prophecy might date Obadiah to sometime immediately prior to the fall of Jerusalem, between 600 and 587, 586 BC. We have some evidence for an earlier date, the 850-ish date. We also have a bit of evidence against an earlier date. Evidence for the earlier date, we have the possibility that Jeremiah read and adapted Obadiah. If you look, I think Feinberg even discusses the potential connections between Jeremiah and Obadiah. We also have just as many scholars who claim that Obadiah read and adapted Jeremiah, and so Jeremiah would be primary and Obadiah would be secondary. And then you have those who say that Obadiah and Jeremiah both used a previous source. So on one hand, if you have Jeremiah reading and adapting Obadiah, then obviously Obadiah is primary. It is first, which could mean that it's early date 9th century. But then if you have Obadiah, reading and adapting Jeremiah, then obviously Obadiah is significantly later, probably even post exile or during the period of the exile. Um, um, we also have evidence for earlier date. One of the evidences also may be the fact that there is no mention of the destruction of the temple. Um, Now, this doesn't necessarily point to a ninth century date, but certainly we would expect that if Obadiah was writing after the fall of Jerusalem, then there would be some mention of the destruction of the temple. And so, while it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be ninth century, certainly it seems to argue against a date after the fall of Jerusalem. Um, We also have an absence of Aramaic expressions, which we would certainly expect to find and do find in a lot of later material. Um, Also, the nations that are mentioned in Obadiah are earlier enemies of Israel. And then finally, we have Obadiah chastising Israel for a lot of the same sins that are mentioned in the book of Amos, which we know to be mid 8th century. And so, based on these similar sins, we can assume that these books were written relatively close to one another in time. At least, certainly not a 200-year gap between them. Um, we also, however, have some evidence that argues against an earlier date. As we mentioned, the canonical ordering may not be based on chronology, but instead might be thematic. And this is particularly important when we look at the connection between Obadiah and Amos 9:12, because Amos 9:12 talks about Edom and the defeat of Edom, and many have actually proposed that Obadiah is essentially a virtual commentary on Amos 9:12 because it goes into such great detail about the destruction of Edom. And so certainly if that's the case, then it obviously has got to be after Amos and may in fact be well after Amos. Um, Also, another piece of evidence against the earlier date is the rhetorical nature of Obadiah, particularly some of the plainer language that is found in verses 11 and 15b, particularly, which seems to point to this passage as a dramatic representation of a past event. In other words, the fall of Israel. The fall of Jerusalem. Excuse me. Um, because when you look at the language, not just in your English text, but in the Hebrew text, particularly verse 15, has this very real narrative feel, as if it is just recounting an event that has already taken place. So certainly this seems to argue that the destruction of Jerusalem has already taken place, the fall has already taken place, and here Obadiah is recounting the fall of Jerusalem. So what do you do with that language? Who knows? But that certainly seems to be one of those things that argues against an earlier date. And then the last piece of evidence against an earlier date is that we don't really have any mention of Edom being a part of any specific attack on Jerusalem prior to 586 BC. We certainly know from previous passages that Edom is an enemy of Israel, that she is hostile towards Israel. But as far as a specific attack on Judah or on Jerusalem, we don't really have any mention of that elsewhere. So who was Edom? Who is this nation that is being judged so harshly in the book of Obadiah? Traditionally, we understand Edom to have been the nation of Esau, whereas Israel is the nation of Jacob. And so you essentially have sibling nations. Obadiah 10 tells us that the reason for God's judgment of Edom was her violence towards Israel. And even in Exodus 15, we see Edom portrayed as an enemy of Israel. And then again, in 1 Samuel 14, we see Edom listed among the enemies that are defeated by King Saul. Since the time of King David, around 1000 BC, excuse me, Edom had been a vassal of Judah. Essentially, they had been subservient to Judah. And 1 Kings 11:15 through 16 kind of gives us an indication of the hostilities. It tells us that the commander of David's army, Joab, had essentially devastated the nation of Edom, killing almost all of the males in Edom. And so clearly some real hostilities that David would have his commander almost wipe out the entire all the males of Edom. From time to time, however, throughout the years, Edom would rebel and regain her independence. And throughout all of this, she really harbored a great animosity toward Israel, which is interesting if you think about Edom and Israel in terms of Esau and Jacob. I don't know if you guys have siblings. I have one younger brother who's about 16 and a half months younger than I am, and we still have a tendency to butt heads on a lot of issues. And so when I think in terms of the sibling rivalry between myself and my brother, and equate that to the sibling rivalry between Esau and Jacob, and then Edom and Israel, it really is kind of an interesting picture. But there really is just this real animosity of Edom toward Israel. We even see Edom helping Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem and harass the Judeans when the Babylonians come in and take over Judah. So Edom really is kind of like the central enemy, I guess, if you will, for Israel throughout its history, and Edom really is kind of the thorn in Israel's side, if you want to say it that way. So I want us to look just real briefly before we conclude at the day of the Lord in Obadiah, because as I mentioned earlier, I hope that you're starting to see just how prevalent this idea is in the minor prophets, and Obadiah really kind of helps to give us a fuller picture of the day of the Lord. Once again, we have another of the minor prophets speaking of the day of the Lord, and once again, we may have the first prophet to speak of the day of the Lord, depending on how we date Obadiah. I know we've said that for the last 3 weeks, I guess now, with Joel and Amos, and now Obadiah. Each of those could potentially have been the first of the prophets to speak about the day of the Lord. Just depends on how you date all three of those. Yet in Obadiah, the day of the Lord and the imagery surrounding it really takes on an entirely different picture than it has in previous prophets like Joel and Amos. In Joel and Amos, we have this image of the Israelites as waiting, almost in eager anticipation of the day of the Lord, and they believe that it's going to be a day of sweetness and light, and a day of comfort and celebration. And Joel and Amos really come on the scene, and they quickly turn the tables on the Israelites, and they tell them that the day of the Lord is not something to be anticipated. It's not something to take comfort in. It's not something to think about in celebration, because it's going to be a day of judgment, not just for the surrounding nations, but for Israel as well. And then here in the book of Obadiah, we we really see an entirely different picture because we see the nation of Israel has essentially already been judged. They have already gone through this catastrophe. They've already endured God's divine judgment at the hands of the surrounding nations, and so now they're looking to God for salvation. They're crying out, how long, God? How long will you continue to let us suffer at the hands of these other nations? And so in Obadiah we see essentially Act 2 of the day of the Lord, if you will. It's the act in which Israel has already been judged, and now she returns to the Lord, who in turn cast judgment upon Israel's oppressors and upon her enemies, and the foremost among them, obviously, being the nation of Edom. And so the first part of the judgment is out of the way, I guess, if you want to say it that way. Israel has already taken her licks. She's already had her punishment dealt. And so now it's time for God to redeem her, to provide her salvation, and to judge the other nations. And so just as the other nations had rallied together against Israel, God is now moving against the nation of Edom through these other nations with which she was once allied. It's Obadiah talks about how your people who were once your allies are now going to turn against you and march against you. And so God is using these other nations to cast his judgment upon Edom in the same way that he used other nations to cast judgment upon Israel. And so the book of Obadiah really begins to give us this fuller picture of this idea of the day of the Lord. Up until this point, all we've really seen is this idea of the day of the Lord as God's impending judgment on Israel because of her sins. And so now here we begin to see something a little bit differently. We begin to see that God's desire to judge Israel is in order to effect her salvation. His judgment is not punishment for punishment's sake, but rather discipline meant to bring his people back into right relationship with himself. And so when Israel realizes the error of her ways, and when her people once again humble themselves before God and they pray for mercy and salvation, then God turns his wrath away from Israel and turns his wrath upon those other nations, those nations who have oppressed Israel, who have been her enemies, those nations that God has used to judge Israel. And so it's really interesting how we see this picture of the day of the Lord kind of shifting, whereas we see God's intended purpose is not just to judge Israel, not just to punish her, but to discipline her. And I think that's something that's very different when we think about the word judgment or punishment versus discipline. Because when we think about discipline, we think about punishment in order to make us better people, punishment in order to correct us. And so that's what God is doing is he's disciplining Israel. And then once she begins to come around, once she realizes the error of her ways and she begins to cry out for God once again and to follow him, then God moves his judgment away from Israel and he begins to judge the surrounding nations. And so Edom really kind of serves as a picture for what God is going to do against all of the nations that have oppressed Israel. And so I hope you kind of realized just how differently the day of the Lord imagery is here in Obadiah, whereas it's not specifically aimed at Israel, but now the day of the Lord and The judgment is aimed at Israel's enemies, which is what Israel was expecting all along. They didn't realize that they had to be judged first, which is what happens. The people of God are the ones who ought to be judged first, because we are the ones that ought to be held to a higher standard. And so Israel had to learn that. Israel had to endure God's judgment because of that. And after they had been judged and after they had repented, then God turns his judgment against Israel's enemies. So if you guys have any other questions, feel free to email me, text message me, whatever. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week. Shalom.